In August 2016, 19-year-old Shana Grice was terrified. For months she'd been the target of a stalker, her ex-partner, 27-year-old Michael Lane. Despite them only being together for a short time, Lane was obsessed with Shana and refused to accept when the pair broke up. This was part of a long pattern of behaviour with Lane. No was not a word he understood. He had groomed, harassed, manipulated and assaulted numerous women and children over at least a decade. He began displaying increasingly sinister behaviour towards Shana, starting with leaving flowers on her car, to installing a tracking device on this vehicle, and eventually stealing her house keys, letting himself in at night and standing watching her sleep. Shana begged Sussex Police to take Lane's behaviour seriously and protect her from him. Not once, not twice, but 5 times. The response of the police was disgusting, and instead of being helped, Shana was actually fined for wasting their time. Shana could see the danger of Lane, and she was screaming out for someone to stop him, but no one listened. On the 25th of August 2016, the police finally took notice, but this was only after Lane had broken into Shana's property, slit her throat, and set fire to her body, following through with the ominous threat he'd made to a friend to make sure that Shana would, quote, pay for what she's done. This case is important as it highlights the utter incompetence of the police and the tragic story of one young lady's fight to be heard. Also, it's critical to raise awareness about stalkers, as they are potentially some of the most dangerous, unstable and persistent offenders I've ever come across, who subject their victims to weeks, months, or even years of psychological torture, but many are fully capable of escalating to acts of extreme violence, including murder. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Shana Grice was born on January the 13th, 1997, in the town of Portslade, which is in the county of West Sussex, in southeast England. She was the only child of Sharon Grice and Richard Green. After her death, her parents described their daughter as follows, quote, Shana was a beautiful, bright and bubbly, kind-natured 19-year-old who brought joy to all those who knew her and loved her. She was very popular throughout childhood. She made friends easily and was never grumpy. She loved life and was always very enthusiastic. She particularly enjoyed spending time with her grandparents, with whom she had a very strong relationship. While Shana was still at school, she began a relationship with a boy called Ashley Cook, known as Ash, and when she left in 2015 at age 18, she soon found a job as a receptionist at a company called Brighton Fire Alarms. She was hoping to save money towards her dream wedding to Ash. However, Shana would never get married, and within a year, she would be dead. It was whilst working at the company that she met the person who would end her life. A man 8 years older than her, called Michael Lane. He was a man with a troubled past. He was a predator who had harassed and groomed multiple women and children over the years. A man who would not take no for an answer, and he'd now set his sights on Shana. There seems to be nothing reported about Michael Lane's childhood, aside from the fact that he was born in 1989. It's clear, based on his subsequent behaviour, that he was a troubled child, then a man, who struggled to deal with any situation where he was rejected and seemed utterly dependent on relationships to define himself. He would manipulate and control those who did agree to be with him and would do anything to maintain his hold over them. Lane, from his teenage years, had a repeating pattern which involved targeting those younger than him, no doubt using their naivety and the power disparity to manipulate and control them. Initially, he would try to groom children, and, in order to find victims, he would volunteer for youth groups. The first concerns were noted when Michael Lane was just 16 years old in 2005, when he'd volunteered to work with the Girl Guides and Scouts. During a camping trip, he began sending sexually inappropriate messages to an 11-year-old girl called Ellie Mae. Ellie Mae's father found the messages and reported them to the guide leader, but the organisation failed to call the police. All contact then stopped for several years, but then Lane reappeared in Ellie Mae's life and would drive slowly next to her when she was walking home from school, offering her a lift. She sensibly declined. However, this was not the last she would hear from him. The girl guides and scouts did nothing about these concerns, and Lane was allowed to remain working with children, and he took full advantage of this, targeting more girls. In 2006, Lane tried to sexually assault a 16-year-old girl called Barbara, who he'd known since she was 6 years old when she was in the Girl Guides. She managed to push him off, and Lane then appeared to act as if nothing had happened. There was no contact for 2 years, until 2008, when Barbara got random explicit messages from Lane, with him offering to pay her for sex. In 2008, Lane started sending sexually inappropriate messages to a 15-year-old he met through the guides, telling her he was touching himself whilst thinking about her. In 2010, when he was 21 years old, Michael Lane used his position to groom a 14-year-old girl called Daphne. He sent her sexual messages via text and Facebook. This was reported to the police, and Lane was arrested on suspicion of grooming an underage girl. The police felt there was not enough evidence to convict him, but a sex offender warning marker was placed on the police system against his name. Ridiculously, despite repeated concerns, Lane, although initially suspended, was told he could continue to work with children, but he resigned. The heat was on, and so he decided to lay low for a while. However, by 2013, he was volunteering with a youth music group, and this is where he met a teenager called Elsa, who was around 16 or 17 years old at the time, so approximately 7 years younger than Lane. They began a relationship in November of that year, but whilst Elsa stated that Lane was initially kind and considerate, he soon became controlling and abusive. He would demand to know where she was at all times and would expect responses to his texts immediately. He was also extremely jealous. In April 2014, so just 5 months into their relationship, Lane went with Elsa to a dance competition that she was performing in. She began speaking to the fellow contestants, and soon Lane was fuming and asked if they could speak in private. Elsa agreed, and as soon as they were on their own, he accused her of ignoring him and flirting with other men. She tried to escape, and he pushed her hard against the wall and put his face right up against hers. When Elsa tried to break away, Lane grabbed her wrist. Elsa then began to cry, and Lane simply walked away. Whilst Lane had a sensitivity to Elsa speaking to other men, he seemed to have no issue pursuing other relationships outside of her. This included a 17-year-old girl called Fiona, who was a troubled young lady who met Lane in 2014. She was having a difficult time in life and spoke to Lane about her problems. He was a shoulder to cry on. Lane tried to get her to be in a relationship with him, and when she refused, he bombarded her with messages saying he was now going to kill himself. He began being seen in his van outside her home and school repeatedly, and this only stopped when a family member warned him off. In October 2014, Elsa went with friends to Tenerife for a long weekend. Lane didn't want her to go, and as she was boarding the plane, he sent her a picture of a local beach, telling her he was going to walk into the sea and drown himself. By this point, Elsa was tired of Lane and carried on with the holiday. This was despite him messaging her repeatedly, morning, noon and night. This included him sending a message containing a picture of 2 knives, which he said he was going to use to end his life. Elsa contacted Lane's mother to raise concerns and asked her to check on her son. Lane was completely fine. Elsa broke up with Lane when she got back from the trip. This sent him into a spiral. He became suicidal and depressed, and appeared to be unable to accept the relationship breakdown. Months later, in March 2015, Michael Lane turned up completely unannounced at Elsa's place of work and demanded to speak to her. He tried to give her an envelope, but she refused to take it. Inside was apparently a suicide note. Clearly, this was a manipulative tactic. He was expecting her to read it and then fall back into his arms. Lane then said before he left that he was going to jump in front of a train. The police were called, but it seems his behaviour was put down to him being in crisis, and he was referred to the mental health team. In April 2015, just 2 months before he first met Shana Grice, Ellie Mae, the girl, now a woman, that he'd been harassing on and off for 10 years since he began grooming her in 2005 when she was 11, suddenly began receiving sexually explicit messages from Lane, including him offering her £500 for sex. Soon after this, he quote-unquote randomly came upon her in a pub, and despite her being with her boyfriend and showing no interest in him, he began to send her creepy flirtatious messages saying she should kiss him. He also sent her a picture of the outside of her house, saying he could see her. Between 2006 and 2015, Michael Lane had groomed, harassed, and assaulted approximately 11 children and young women, and those are just the ones we know about. It was clear that he was a man who would not take no for an answer, and if he was rejected, he would manipulate and lie in order to get what he wanted. He was also extremely controlling and jealous. Whilst he didn't have a pattern of serious violence, there were flashes of what he was capable of. He was an unstable predator who had spent at least 10 years acting in this way, targeting younger, vulnerable and naive females in an attempt to force them to be with him, and more importantly, stay with him. And in June 2015, he came across 18-year-old Shana Grice, a young woman, barely an adult, who had only just left school, and he decided he was going to have her at all costs. Shana was a perfect target for Michael Lane. She'd only recently left school and was 8 years younger than him. No doubt he was drawn to her youth and likely naivety. She wouldn't be able to see the danger he posed until it was too late. Lane was, as he had been before, undeterred by the fact that Shana had a boyfriend, and in fact, he became aware that while Shana and Ash had been together for a number of years, it seems their relationship, especially around 2015, was turbulent and was characterised by arguments, breaking up and making up. Lane saw an opportunity to exploit Shana's distress about her issues with Ash. He began flirting with Shana, making any excuse to hang around the reception area where she worked. Soon, he began to buy her gifts. She was flattered by the attention of an older man, and the pair began a sexual relationship. The relationship lasted for around 4 to 5 months, so from around August until December 2015, and it was clear from text messages recovered later that while Shana had strong feelings for Lane, he was completely obsessed with her. He would text her every minute of every day. Unfortunately, she couldn't see that this man was showing her an alarming level of attention only weeks after they'd first met. Lane began showing possessive and jealous behaviour almost immediately. If he saw Shana talking to a man at work, he would find ways to interject into their conversation so this interaction would stop. If he was unable to do this, he would literally stand and stare from a distance with a scowl on his face. At the work Christmas party that year, he's reported to have been drunk and angry because Shana was talking to work colleagues who were male. The relationship between Shana and Lane ended around this time. She had decided she wanted to fully commit to her relationship with Ash Cook, and she informed Lane of this. He did not take it well and refused to accept their relationship was over. Before talking about the stalking of Shana Grice, it's important to point out just how prolific Michael Lane was in his predatory behaviour towards women. Being with Shana didn't mean that he wasn't looking for other girls and women to victimise. In August 2015, the month his relationship with Shana began, Lane reapplied to work with children's groups and was accepted and began working with the Scouts organisation, but eventually resigned a few months later. This same month, he began sending messages to a woman he used to go to school with and whom he had sporadic contact around the area over the years. He sent her a message asking if she still lived at the same address, and then began noticing him sat outside in his work van repeatedly. This woman became alarmed and actively avoided her own home in order to not see Lane. In October 2015, he sent an unsolicited text to a neighbour of his asking for a date. She didn't reply. In December 2015, a woman called Ingrid was approached by Lane in the local pub, and he began flirting with her. The pair did little more than exchange names and pleasantries before she made her excuses to go to the toilet. Lane followed and waited outside. When Ingrid re-emerged, Lane was standing against a wall. As she passed him, he grabbed her wrists and pulled her towards his face, trying to kiss her. She pushed him away. Ingrid went and found her friend that she'd come to the pub with, and they promptly left. The next day, she received a friend request on Facebook from Lane with an accompanying message saying, quote, "Hey, it was very nice meeting you. Sorry with what happened, but you wanted it too." Remember, this is the month that he was showing sexual jealousy towards Shana for speaking to other men. Approximately a week later, a woman called Julie, who vaguely knew Lane, was in the same pub as him, and she walked past him. At this point, he put both of his hands on her hips. She was unsure if this was sexual or accidental, and so just ignored it. The next day, she received a message on Facebook from Lane stating that he wanted to perform oral sex on her. So despite him seeking out repeated opportunities for sexual encounters with other women whilst with Shana, when she tried to break things off with him and resume her previous relationship, he couldn't accept this. It was one rule for him and a different set of rules for the women he fixated on. He expected them to be completely loyal to him whilst he acted in any manner that he wanted. Michael Lane had no intention of relinquishing his hold over Shana Grice, and so he began to stalk her, and this continued right up until the day of her death. It's important to point out here that as well as stalking Shana, Michael Lane was still sending disgusting messages to various women, so I'll interweave this information into this section. So on December the 31st, 2015, Ash Cook found a note in his car which read, quote, "Dear Ash, Shana has and always will cheat on you. Happy New Year." Ash confronted Shana about this, and she denied that she and Lane had ever been more than friends. It's obvious why she did this. She didn't want him to know that she'd been in a sexual relationship with another man. On the 13th of January 2016, Shana's 19th and last birthday, she received a bunch of flowers with no note at her place of work. She thought they were from Ash, so called to thank him, but he had no idea what she was talking about. Shana called the florist and found out it was Lane who'd sent them. She complained to her boss about Lane. A few days later, she found her tyres had been slashed, and Ash found his car had been keyed. Unknown to Shana was that Lane had fitted a tracker to the underside of her car, and using an app on his phone, was able to access real-time information on her location and receive text messages whenever the car began or stopped moving. Lane would, under the cover of darkness, retrieve this device, recharge it, and then reattach it to Shana's car. He would use this information to follow her and appear randomly wherever she was in order to force an interaction between them. It appears there were other incidents of damage to Shana's tyres before this point, but I have no details of these. But this pattern, coupled with the most recent incident of her tyres being slashed, meant that she was becoming frightened. Shana spoke to the HR department at work, and they checked the GPS data on Lane's work van, and it showed an alarming pattern of him driving down Shana's street and sitting outside her home at times when he should have been working, and also he was doing this outside of work hours. Whilst it didn't prove that he was the one damaging her car, it clearly was him. Shana made her first call to Sussex Police on the 8th of February 2016. She outlined her concerns and asked them to speak to Lane. She told them that her and Lane had always just been friends. Again, the reason for this is clear. She didn't want Ash to find out. The police spoke to the HR department at Shana and Lane's place of work, and a manager not only confirmed that it appeared that he was showing a worrying level of interest in Shana, but they specifically expressed concern for her safety. Lane was spoken to informally, and he denied everything. There was insufficient evidence to arrest or charge him, but he was told to stay away from Shana. On March 24, 2016, Shana was at home, a bungalow in Christory Road in Portslade, when her two housemates she lived with came home from a night out with mutual friends in tow. This included Michael Lane, who tagged along. Upon seeing Lane in her home, Shana was furious as she confronted him. She quickly bundled up some clothes and announced she was going to stay with Ash. As she walked down the street, phone in hand, Lane chased her and tried to grab the phone, whilst also pulling Shana's hair. A passerby stopped their car and asked if she was okay. They offered her a lift, and Shana accepted. When she got to Ash's house, the police were called. An officer attended to speak to Shana. His name was PC Trevor Godfrey, whose name we'll come back to later, and who was not only the epitome of an awful police officer, but also a terrible person. He spoke to her in front of Ash, and so again, she minimised the nature of her previous relationship with Michael Lane. Michael Lane was tracked down and admitted what he'd done. As we'll get to later, he showed some text messages to PC Godfrey, showing that Shana had been dishonest about them having previously been in an intimate relationship. This apparently meant that what Michael Lane had done was perfectly fine. He received a caution for assaulting Shana, essentially a slap on the wrists, but, as we'll get to later, he was lucky to even get that. However, that's not the end of the story. It appears that at some point, PC Godfrey spoke to Shana again, this time privately, and she confirmed that she had in fact been in a sexual relationship with Michael Lane. The next thing she knew, PC Godfrey was calling her back and telling her that she was being issued with a fine of £90 for wasting police time. Shana was devastated. She was receiving more of a punishment for simply reporting what had happened to her than the man who had assaulted her. 4 days later, Shana left her job, citing Lane's behaviour as a reason. The company were monitoring Lane, and after Shana left, he was spending even more time in his work van driving near her house during work hours when he had no reason to be in that area. HR called him and told him he needed to attend an urgent meeting to discuss his behaviour, but he resigned before this happened. In May 2016, whilst also stalking Shana, Lane sent messages to a woman called Karen, including a video of him masturbating on a bed. She was disgusted and told him to fuck off. She later told police that Lane had previously sent her sexually inappropriate messages when she was 15 years old, so around 7 years before. During this same month, he contacted Elsa, the woman he'd broken up with, in October 2015, and stated that he was miserable without her and wanted to reunite. In June 2016, Lane followed Shana to a property she was staying in and burst through the front door to confront her. However, it was around this time that Shana's relationship with Ash Cook broke down again, and it appears, unfortunately, that she again began a sexual relationship with Michael Lane. Her relationship with Ash resumed quickly, and for a short time, she was in a relationship with both men. Despite Lane having apparently gotten what he wanted, he continued to victimise other women. In June 2016, whilst back in a relationship with Shana, Lane turned up on the doorstep of Ellie Mae, continuing a pattern of behaviour towards her which had gone on for over a decade. He talked his way into her property. When he was there, he pushed himself against her. She told him to leave and walked away. He then followed her and pushed her to the ground. It was only when she threatened to scream he eventually left. The reunion with Shana was short-lived. By the end of June 2016, just a few weeks later, she again told him that she didn't want to be in a relationship with him and wanted to commit to Ash. This was, in my opinion, the tipping point which set Michael Lane down the path to murder, and his behaviour towards Shana, as well as other women, became more sinister and concerning. In early July 2016, Lane contacted a woman called Lorraine, who, like so many others, he'd first met when she was a child through volunteering for the Girl Guides. He repeatedly called and texted her before sending her a picture of his hand around his erect penis with the following message, quote, "No strings, just this making you come." Lorraine told Lane to stop and blocked him. A few days later, on the 8th of July 2016, Lane went to Shana's property to apparently collect some of his belongings. Unknown to her, whilst he was there, he pocketed her back door key. At 6 AM the next morning, Shana woke up to the sound of breathing and was aware there was a man stood in her room. Lane had used the back door key to break in and was standing over Shana, watching her sleep. She lay in terror, hiding under her duvet, until she heard the man leave. She got up and looked out of the window and saw Lane walking away. To avoid a repeat of what had happened before, Shana decided that she needed to get evidence before she called the police, and so she telephoned Lane and recorded the call. This is part of it.
So, one question that's really bugging me. Why did you take the key in the first place?
I wanted to see you.
Yeah, but that...
I wanted to see you and properly talk to you, and I knew you wouldn't let me in otherwise.
Yeah, but that's not good because it's putting us in danger. You could have flipped at any point. What about
No,
if...
I wouldn't have flipped.
What about if I took... What about if I took someone home or something and then you came in and saw that I was with someone else?
Oh, I just would have left.
Well, but you left anyway.
Yeah, I know I did.
But it's just, yeah, you had no right at all to...
Oh, no, I didn't. Oh, no, I got no right or nothing. I know that.
Well, you need to apologise to the girls because it's out of order.
Yeah, I know. I just don't want any trouble because the last thing I want is to prison that.
Yeah. Well, just as long you just don't do it again. And if you come near the house again,
I won't come near the house again. I won't contact you again. Okay.
I think that's best because it's just going to keep on going around this vicious circle, isn't it?
No, just a pathetic, manipulative whimpering towards the end of the recording. This is not the complete call, and I'm not sure why the rest has never been released, but I have the transcript of the rest. Lane continues to cry and act like he's remorseful, and states, quote, "Obviously something's not right in my head, and I don't know what it is, but I know I need to find out, or be locked up or something." Shana called the police and met with an officer called PC John Mills. She presented the voice recording and told him what had happened. It's clear in the recording that Lane is essentially admitting being in Shana's bedroom, but despite this, when PC Mills arrested Lane, he simply cautioned him for stealing the door key. There were no consequences for the break-in. On the 10th of July 2016, Shana called Sussex Police again, reporting a series of silent phone calls she was receiving, including several where she could just hear heavy breathing. Shana described herself as, quote, "worried and scared." These were calls later established as being made by Lane, including using his landline. PC Mills, who was now handling the case, did nothing. Just 2 days later, Shana again called the police and reported that Michael Lane was following her in his car to a new place of work, and she kept on seeing him wherever she went, either driving, parked up, or on foot. This information was passed to PC Mills. He didn't action anything and didn't call Shana back. In fact, she had to persistently call him to get an update. Remember, we're just a few weeks away from Shana's murder at this point. The stalking continues, the silent phone calls, seeing Lane everywhere that she went, and Ash Cook also started receiving derogatory messages about Shana. Friends told her that she needed to call the police, but she specifically said that she wasn't going to bother because they hadn't done anything in the past, and she also didn't want to get fined again. In August 2016, the month of her death, Lane sent Shana a message demanding she pay him back hundreds of pounds for gifts he'd chosen to buy her during their relationship. Shana Grice was being ground down. She was a shell of her former self, and in the absence of any help from the police, she thought she'd come up with a plan to end the situation with Michael Lane. She agreed to meet him at a hotel on the 23rd of August 2016, less than 2 days before her murder. It appears that the plan was to have one last sexual encounter, one last goodbye, and then they would be done. And this is what appears to have happened. The pair spent a few hours together, but at the end of their time, Shana told Lane that it was definitely over. There was no chance of ever getting back together or having sex again. She wanted him to stop following and harassing her. She didn't want to see him again. Outwardly, Michael Lane said that he accepted this, but inside, he was fuming. Despite him clearly contacting multiple women, Shana was allowed to be anyone else's but his. She was his possession. He spoke to a friend of his on the same day, moaning about how Shana had left him, and then made an ominous threat that Shana would, quote, pay for what she's done. It's clear that he decided that if he couldn't have Shana, then no one else would. And less than 48 hours after this meeting in the hotel, Shana Grice would be dead. Michael Lane began his preparations to murder Shana Grice on the 24th of August 2016. He was seen on CCTV that afternoon filling up a red petrol can at West Hove Sainsbury's petrol station. He also put matches and a change of clothes into his car, and at 7:25 a.m. the next morning, Thursday the 25th of August 2016, his car was seen driving past Shana's bungalow on Chris Dorey Road in Portslade, with him parking a short distance away. At 7:29 a.m, he was captured on CCTV walking in the direction of Shana's house, wearing a light-coloured top, knee-length dark shorts, white Lonsdale trainers, and carrying a blue baseball cap. He then arrived at her property. His timing was not arbitrary. He knew that Shana's two housemates left early for their jobs, and there was a small window of time where she would be alone before she went to work. Lane broke in, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, and went into Shana's bedroom. What was said between the pair will never be known. Neighbours didn't report any screams or shouts, simply raised voices. It's likely that Shana was taken completely by surprise. Whether Shana had her back to Lane or he spun her around is unclear, but from behind, he raised the knife and cut her throat. Shana slumped next to the bed, and it's believed that she was conscious for several minutes before finally dying from massive blood loss. Lane apparently stood there, watching her taking her last breaths. Shana died at around 7:40 a.m. When she was dead, or potentially while she was dying, Michael Lane began rummaging through Shana's belongings and took her bank card. He also took a hoodie from the property and put it on, as well as the baseball cap, to conceal his face. Just before 8 AM, Lane was seen walking away from the scene of the crime. 6 minutes later, he was then captured at an ATM, where he withdrew £60 from the account of the woman he just murdered. Lane then returned to his vehicle and drove to a local shop to buy some water before driving back and again parking close to Shana's house. He stayed in the vehicle for several minutes, and it's believed that he dumped the water from the bottle out of the window and then filled it with the petrol he'd bought the day before. At 8:22 AM, Lane re-entered Shana's house and moved her body onto the bed. He then splashed petrol over her and the room before striking a match and setting her on fire. He then closed the bedroom door and left again. Just over half an hour later, at 8:56 AM, Michael Lane was seen returning to the same shop that he bought the water from, but this time he was there to check his lottery ticket. He changed his top by this point, likely as the one he'd been wearing smelt of petrol. He then returned home, showered, disposed of the murder weapon and his clothing, neither of which has ever been recovered, and hid his bloody shoes. He then went about his day as normal and travelled to work, arriving at a garage called Set Tyres on London Road in Burgess Hill at around midday. He then began to work on cars. No one who saw Michael Lane that day said that he seemed stressed or anxious. He was completely calm and in control. At around 9:20 AM, Shana's work were worried. It wasn't like her to be late, and they hadn't heard from her, so they called her boyfriend Ash Cook. He was concerned too, and so called his sister Amy and asked her to go and check that Shana was okay. When Amy arrived, she found the front door closed and a bloody footprint on the front step. She then called her father, Ian Cook, who was there within minutes. He looked through the letterbox and could see and smell smoke. He called the police and an ambulance, and whilst waiting for them, managed to get entry to the property. In the bedroom, through a haze of smoke, he could see a body lying face down on the bed. He couldn't see the face, but could see long blonde hair. He left the property, walked straight into the arms of the police and paramedics, who entered the bungalow. They found Shana lying dead on her bed, and they saw that her throat had been cut. Her body was burnt, but it appears that whilst the fire that Lane started caused damage to her and the room she was in, it quickly consumed the air in the room and then petered out. The police quickly cordoned off the area and began a murder investigation. Within hours, they would identify and arrest the prime suspect, the only suspect, Michael Lane. Unfortunately, it was only after Shana Grice had been murdered that the police finally acted. They checked their records and saw the long list of concerns that she'd reported, and which had been ignored. At 1:50 PM on the 25th of August 2016, approximately 6 hours after he'd killed Shana, Michael Lane was arrested on suspicion of murder approximately 11 miles away from the scene of the crime at the garage where he was working. The police only had limited time to either charge or release him, and he was interviewed 4 times initially. However, Lane stuck to his story. He had nothing to do with Shana's murder and knew nothing about it, as shown by this short clip.
So at about 9:45 yesterday morning, Shana Grice was found dead in her bedroom. Tell me what happened to her.
I don't know.
Well, when her body was found, it was clear that someone had assaulted her, and they'd tried to set fire to her body. So tell me what you know about what happened to her yesterday.
I only know what I've been told since being in here.
The police didn't have enough evidence, and so Michael Lane was bailed, pending further investigations. This final period of freedom would be short-lived. Over the next few days, the police rapidly gathered evidence to charge and eventually convict Lane. They trawled through thousands of hours of CCTV footage from cameras on streets, outside people's homes, even in buses, to create a minute-by-minute timeline of Lane's movements, both before and after the murder, which I presented in the previous section. It was an astute member of the public who sealed Lane's fate. On the 30th of August 2016, 5 days after the murder, a woman saw a man acting suspiciously on a single-track path leading to New Barn Farm in Portslade, and he appeared to dump something into some bushes. She recognised the man, as his image had been in the news, as a suspect in a murder, and so she called the police. Officers attended, and, in the hedgerow, they recovered a pair of blood-stained white Lonsdale trainers. The blood on the trainers was quickly found to belong to Shana, and DNA from inside the shoe matched Michael Lane. The trainers were also found to match the footprints found at the crime scene perfectly. So on the 2nd of September 2016, Michael Lane was re-arrested for Shana Grice's murder and was interviewed a further 3 times. During the first 2 interviews, he continued with his ridiculous story, but the police presented him with all the evidence. Although the police essentially had him banged to rights, in Lane's mind, he seemed to think he could still get away with this, so he came up with an absolutely ridiculous story, as shown by this brief police interview footage.
Okay, so having had a moment, what do you want to tell us?
You ain't going to believe me, but it's up to you. In the morning, I did go to Shana's. After I'd been to Valley Road shops,
Yeah.
and I was seen going back, parked up. When I went past her road, her car was still there,
Okay.
which I knew was odd because she was meant to be. I knew she had started work at 8:30, and that was about the time. It was about 20 past 8, so I knew she would have had to have left for work. So I went round, walked round there. The door was open. The front door was open.
Wide open or unlocked?
No, it was open. No, it wasn't wide open, but it was like half open. So I went in there. Her bedroom door was open, half open again, and she was on the floor.
Tell me about your thought process then, about what made you think, right, rather than just calling the police and the ambulance, I'm going to just leave.
Because I was scared. I didn't know what. I'd never seen a dead body. I didn't know what was going on. Didn't know.
Okay, so let's go with this idea that you're scared. Talk me through that. What were you scared would happen?
Well, the police would turn up and think that I did it.
So, just to reiterate, Michael Lane is claiming that he just so happened to be going past Shana's home and saw a car was there when she should have been at work, and so, being the kind person he was, went to check she was alright. He then walks in and sees Shana's dead body. However, this is where the concern apparently disappeared. Instead of calling the police so they could find the monster that did this to someone he claimed to love, or calling an ambulance just in case there was a chance of saving Shana's life, he left. Well, he left, but not before rummaging through her belongings to get her bank cards. He then stole money from her account, came to her house a second time for some reason, went to check whether he'd won the lottery, and then calmly went to work. I do admire the composure of officers who interview pathetic people like this. I'd be so tempted to just jump across the table and give them a slap. I doubt that would go down too well in court, with the judge asking, "Why did you slap the accused?" Well, he was being a dick, Your Honour. On the 2nd of September 2016, the date of his arrest and the final police interviews, 8 days after the crime, Michael Lane was charged with the murder of Shana Grice. He appeared at Brighton Magistrates Court the next day and was remanded to prison to await his day in Crown Court. Michael Lane pleaded not guilty to the murder of Shana Grice, and so his trial began on the 7th of March 2017 at Lewes Crown Court. The prosecution ripped Lane apart. They showed that he was an obsessive stalker whose behaviour had been escalating, that he told a friend he would make Shana pay for breaking up with him, and his movements on the day of the murder showed that he was the only one who went into her house on the morning of her death. In court, the disgusting dismissive behaviour of Sussex Police was entered into the record, showing that they had fined Shana for wasting police time when she'd simply been trying to get help to stop the man who would eventually murder her. Her phone calls to the police and the recordings she made of Lane were also played in open court, which must have been haunting. listening to the voice of a woman whose life had been so brutally snatched away from her. Michael Lane stuck to his story that he gave to the police during his last interview. He just so happened to stumble across the body of Shana, but he didn't kill her, and then he left. He'd not told anyone about what he'd seen or tried to get help because he was scared he would get the blame. With regards to the bloody shoes, yes, they were his, and he dumped them. They had Shana's blood on them because he'd been in the house, not because he cut her throat. He got rid of them because he thought if the police found them, they would think he did it. However, Lane had added to his narrative to explain other elements of the case, which are equally as laughable. When asked to account for why he'd been seen buying petrol the day before the murder, he denied this was to set fire to Shana's body or to try to destroy evidence. No, he was intending to use this to commit suicide because he was struggling to come to terms with the death of his grandfather. So how did Shana's house get set alight? Lane said he had no idea. When he was there was no smoke, no flames. The jury saw through Lane's lies, and on the 22nd of March 2017, he was unanimously convicted of the murder of Shana Grice. The next day, he stood before Mr. Justice Green for sentencing. Justice Green, completely appropriately in my opinion, ripped into Sussex Police, highlighting the fact that Shana had asked for their help and instead was fined for wasting police time. He said, quote, "In other words, she was treated as the wrongdoer and having committed a criminal offence. Michael Lane was treated as the victim. There was seemingly no appreciation on the part of those investigating that a young woman in a sexual relationship with a man could at one and the same time be vulnerable and at risk of serious harm. The police jumped to conclusions and Shana was stereotyped." With regards to Michael Lane, Justice Green said, quote, "This was a cold-hearted murder. I've not detected in you any appreciation of the devastation you have caused to Shana's family and friends, nor have I detected remorse. Insofar as I detected emotion in you, it's been a determination to do all you can to protect yourself, and you have been the one person you have felt sorry for." He then sentenced him. For the murder of Shana Grice, Michael Lane was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 25 years to serve before he can apply for parole. Unfortunately, this section will make your blood boil, as it seems that despite a young woman being brutally murdered and obvious failings by the police, individuals at fault still justified their shitty decisions and outwardly lied. There was almost no accountability. As a starting point, Shana's parents, Sharon Grice and Richard Green, wanted a public inquiry into the death of their daughter, essentially a full trial of facts, with everyone who was involved testifying in public and answering for their decision making. However, this was refused, as multiple other smaller inquiries conducted by relevant agencies had been undertaken, including a domestic homicide review, an independent Office of Police Conduct investigation, and a report into Sussex Police's handling of stalking cases. Sharon and Richard were not satisfied. It's completely understandable why. These investigations would be done behind closed doors, the reports completed and then put online, and likely forgotten. Box ticked and then move on. They wanted a public forum, not only to get justice for Shana, but also to raise awareness to help others. They petitioned the High Court, the most superior court in the country, to reverse this decision, and this was denied. To add insult to injury, Sharon and Richard attended the misconduct proceedings for the officers from Sussex Police involved in their daughter's case and had to listen to them lying, minimising and essentially shrugging their shoulders about their role in Shana's murder. 13 officers were investigated internally, and eventually only 2 faced specific allegations of misconduct. Their misconduct hearings to determine their culpability and punishment occurred in May and July 2019. The first hearing was for PC John Mills. As a reminder, PC Mills was the officer who arrested Michael Lane in July 2016 when he'd stolen Shana's door key and then broken in. He resigned from the police the week before the hearing, so essentially jumped before he was pushed, and didn't bother to attend the hearing, so it was done in his absence. In the hearing, it transpired that PC Mills questioned Michael Lane regarding this incident for a grand total of 12 minutes. He didn't ask him about any of his history of behaviour and simply let him go. This negligence is even more galling when it transpired that PC Mills had been on a training course about stalkers and how to interview them the day before speaking to Lane. As well, as I said earlier, PC Mills was the lead investigator for many of the incidents leading up to Shana's death. He'd apparently told superiors after her death that he kept her well informed about the handling of the case, but in the hearing, it was shown that he was lying. He didn't call Shana, and it was her who had to chase him. The panel decided that had PC Mills still been a serving police officer, he would have been fired, and he was banned from ever working in the police again. In July 2019, the second hearing took place, this time for PC Trevor Godfrey. By this point, he'd been retired from the police since 2017 after 29 years of service. How this man was ever a police officer is beyond me, as he seems like an utterly despicable human being. He was involved in the earlier stages and was the officer who investigated the assault against Shana in March 2016, where she'd been chased down the street by Lane, who'd then pulled her hair. And, instead of doing anything about Lane, he'd instead called Shana a short time later and told her that she was being fined for wasting police time. So remember, by the time of the hearing, a woman was dead, murdered at the hands of a man who she had repeatedly told the police was stalking her. In addition, this woman's grieving parents were sitting in the room listening to the proceedings. You would expect some contrition, remorse or guilt. None of that was on display. Scathing articles were published about the despicable attitude of PC Godfrey at this hearing. He opened by stating that he was right to find Shana because, quote, "she did waste my time." He added, "She lied to police 3 times. It was only right I advised her she cannot keep lying in police statements and getting people arrested for it." Going further, PC Godfrey apparently believed that Shana was lying about being stalked by Lane, citing text messages that she'd sent him, with him stating, quote, "She would be signing her text with 5 kisses. This is not harassment, it was a smokescreen to disguise her affair." Most disturbingly of all is that despite Michael Lane literally telling PC Godfrey that he did indeed assault Shana, he'd spoken to his superiors and said that he didn't believe that Lane should receive any sort of punishment at all. Those above him disagreed, and so Lane was issued with a caution, a very minimal sanction, but it's clear that PC Godfrey was arguing against even that, despite, I'll repeat this again, Michael Lane fucking admitting assaulting Shana Grice to his face. With regards to issuing the fine for wasting police time, PC Godfrey fell back on stating that his superiors had told him to do this, but it transpired that he was the one who initiated and pushed these superiors to do this. PC Godfrey stated that, looking back on the case, even at that point, he still stood by the fact there was nothing at all to suggest Shana was in danger. So PC Godfrey, a man who was a police officer for 29 years, appeared to think that it was okay for a man to assault a woman if they were in a relationship, and that a woman sending text messages with kisses somehow means that the coward who lays hands on them cannot be arrested, and this also means they can never be harassed or stalked. This man's horrific, unapologetic behaviour makes me question whether he actually thought that Shana deserved what eventually happened to her. Unbelievably, the panel concluded that, whilst PC Godfrey should have investigated things better, had he still been a serving police officer, he would have not been sacked. So he was able to retain a full police pension, whilst Shana Grice, the woman he failed, lay in the ground. I think it was concluded that it was too harsh to strip him of his police pension, so they gave him a lesser punishment, despite him clearly, in my opinion, being the more negligent of the 2 officers. Sharon and Richard were devastated. They said the outcome was, quote, "a joke and the hearing a sham. Had Godfrey not retired, he would be allowed to carry on serving as a police officer. What message does this give to other officers? Even more importantly, what message does it send to victims? We are disgusted and feel thoroughly let down by the process. There is no justice." They added, Godfrey's testimony only proved his discriminatory attitude, even accusing Shana of coercing Lane. We can barely believe what we have heard. Godfrey stereotyped Shana from the outset. We didn't stand a chance. So only 2 officers faced any type of disciplinary hearing, and both had already left the police. One of them clearly resigned the week before to avoid being held accountable, and to ensure that he was paid right up until the last minute before he was forced out. He didn't even have the courage or respect to bother to show up and look Shana's parents in the eye, or God forbid, actually apologise to them, or show any sort of empathy for two people whose world had been destroyed. The second, who was happily living off his police pension, which he was allowed to keep, essentially used the hearing, knowing full well Shana's parents were sat there, to justify and minimise his actions and tell them that their dead daughter was a liar. I find this case so heartbreaking. Shana was failed by the police both whilst Sorry, I just got to go back to this PC Godfrey guy. Fuck you, dude. Seriously. Anyway, find this case so heartbreaking. Shana was failed by the police, both while she was alive and after her murder. I make these videos in large part because these victims need to be recognised, their stories told, their bravery highlighted, their memories preserved, and their names remembered. Her name was Shana Grice. She was born on January the 13th, 1997, and left this world just 19 years later, on the 25th of August 2016. Rest in peace, Shana. I'm going to begin with a profile of Michael Lane before talking about support services in the next section. So in order to explain who Lane was and why he did what he did, I need to explain what stalking is, as well as the different types of stalkers, how they behave and why. The good definition of stalking I found is, quote, fixated, obsessive, unwanted and repeated behaviour that makes you feel pestered and harassed. It includes behaviour that happens 2 or more times, directed at or towards you by another person, which causes you to feel alarmed or distressed, or to fear violence might be used against you. There are different typologies of stalker. Different research suggests different categories, but the majority cite 5 main ones. Each type of stalker differs in terms of their relationship to the victim, i.e. known to them or a complete stranger, and the ultimate aim of their stalking behaviour, for example a relationship, reconciliation after a breakdown, a sexual encounter, etc. The most dangerous type of stalker is the rejected stalker, and Michael Lane is an archetypal example of one of these. Rejected stalkers are those who have been in an intimate relationship with their victim and the behaviour begins after a breakup. These individuals are usually completely dependent on the relationship, have extremely low self-esteem and a fear of abandonment and rejection. When the relationship ends, they'll do anything to reconcile as they cannot cope and will use what they know about their former partner's life and routine in order to engage in a pattern of intrusive behaviour. Their behaviour is often contradictory at first, fluctuating between signs of affection and overt menacing acts. This is them using different tactics to woo and frighten their victim into getting what they want. They may move between these two states, but as time goes on and they are unsuccessful, they become more desperate and angry. Their stalking behaviour pushes their victim further away, so they chase them even more. These types of stalkers will often ignore any restrictions put in their way. They'll breach bail, restraining orders, civil injunctions. They are fixated on one thing: getting to their victim. However, importantly for this case, weak action by the authorities can essentially be seen as a green light by the stalker to carry on and embolden them to escalate their behaviour. Eventually, sometimes very quickly, signs of affection fall away and the behaviour becomes more overtly threatening, essentially placing their victim in a position where the only way the terror they're experiencing will stop is if they comply. However, there often comes a point where the stalker finally realises they will never get what they want. Then the focus switches purely to punishment, and they will go to extraordinary lengths to try and destroy that person's life. This can include destroying relationships with friends or family, breaking up new relationships, trying to get them arrested or imprisoned, getting them fired from their job, trying to get their children removed from their care. Literally anything you can think of that will cause their victim as much distress as possible. It's not an exact science. They may be skipping about in terms of behaviour, but this is the general progression that I've found most often. This is horrifying enough, and the victim will suffer psychological torture and fear 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, not feeling safe in any environment. Those who have watched my channel for a while will know that low self-esteem and fear of abandonment are also common features of domestic abuse, and that is correct. Almost always, rejected stalkers will be abusive in their relationships, trying to control their partners, and then continue this behaviour after their victim has tried to break away. So essentially, a rejected stalker is usually a domestic abuser after the relationship has ended. This context helps to explain what happened to Shana, and you'll be able to see the progression of Michael Lane's behaviour and the danger that she was actually in, which places you about 10 steps ahead of the incompetent officers at Sussex Police who utterly failed to spot or act on the warning signs which could have prevented her horrific death. Beginning at the start, we cannot comment much on Michael Lane's upbringing, but he was clearly an extremely damaged child and then a man who had a pathological inability to be on his own or deal with any form of rejection. Many of us struggle with these things, but Lane decided that the best way to deal with this was by finding people who could utterly dominate, manipulate, and essentially keep them like objects, just so that he wouldn't fall apart. From an early age, he targeted children. Even at this stage, he clearly worked out that the easiest people to target and dominate were children. He could enamour them with the trappings of adulthood, like driving and having disposable income, which would impress them, and their youth would make them easier to control, far easier to manipulate. And he did this time and time again. These children made him feel superior. This was clearly in contrast to how he was perceived by adult women, which was likely as a weirdo and a lech. Michael Lane's pathological inability to cope on his own is shown by just how many girls and women he targeted. Some of these were potentially about just getting his sexual needs met at any given time, but ultimately he was collecting girls and women so that if any of them abandoned him, he would have someone to replace them with and not have to spend a second feeling unwanted and unloved. He expected all of these women to essentially put their lives on hold, not speak to any other men, and instead focus every second of their time on him. And this speaks to the utter hypocrisy of his behaviour. All of these women couldn't leave him, they had to stay laser focused on him, but he was okay to potter about and try and add to his collection. I'm using possessive language deliberately because to Michael Lane, all of the women and children he victimised were just objects, and their only purpose was to stop him feeling lonely, small, and abandoned. In 2015, Michael Lane met Shana Grice. She was significantly younger than him, fresh out of school, and while she was in a relationship, this seems to have been quite rocky. She was the perfect target, and Lane no doubt felt he could exploit her naivety and situation to his advantage, and he was initially successful. However, Shana wanted to break away. Her leaving him was unacceptable. Her role was to make him feel better. She was not free to leave his life. They'd begun a relationship, therefore he was in control from that point on, including when it ended. The breakdown of the relationship in December 2015 led to Lane feeling both intense anger and utter despair and fear. All of his feelings of inadequacy were being reinforced. So he began a campaign of behaviour to coerce Shana into resuming their relationship so he could put her back into his collection. At first, he employed two primary tactics, trying to break up her relationship with Ash and wooing her with flowers. Neither worked, and with regards to the second tactic, he would have been absolutely furious that instead of falling back into his arms as he expected, Shana reported him to her boss. It was at that point that Lane used his first form of overt punishment, slashing Shana's tyres. Essentially, you defied me, here's the consequence. He tracked her vehicle, and this was for several reasons. Firstly, to check if she was seeing other men, but also to bump into Shana by accident, hoping to force a conversation where he believed he could manipulate her into taking him back. However, more generally, it was to make sure that he was literally visible to her so she could see him. This was saying to her, "You want me out of your life? Not gonna happen. I'll be everywhere you are." Shana then raised concerns about Lane to their place of work. Again, his level of anger increased. She wasn't complying. She was fighting back. He then stepped up his tactics, including tagging along with her friends and coming to her home to force her to talk to him, but also, again, to show her that he would be in her life no matter what she wanted. However, she ran from him, and so he chased her and assaulted her. Just a small example of the violence he was capable of. He admitted his crimes to the police, and nothing happened. Well, yes, something did happen. The person he assaulted got fined. This must have been a green light to Michael Lane. He could do whatever he wanted, and there would be no consequences. What motivation did he have to stop? This feeling of invincibility would have increased with every time he went unpunished by the police. The most sinister incident was breaking into Shana's property and standing over her while she slept. This was an act with specific intent to terrify Shana. Again, the message was, I can get to you any time. If you want this to stop, you know what to do. And that's the point of this behaviour. Grind the victim down to the point where they surrender and give the stalker what they want, just to bring an end to the terror. But if they do this, they'll just be in a controlling relationship again, which they'll be desperate to escape from, and if they do, the stalking starts again, and the cycle goes round and round and round. The silent phone calls also served the same purpose. Lane knew that Shana would suspect it was him and feel scared. All she had to do was reunite and things would stop. Unfortunately, the pair did get back together around 2 months before Shana's death, and although this was only for a short time, I believe that Lane felt he'd won, he'd regained control. But then Shana ended things again. I think this is the point where the homicidal thoughts began. Shana had repeatedly, in his mind, defied him, and now she was abandoning him again. This was never about a relationship between two equals. In Lane's mind, this was a power struggle, and he could not stand that Shana was in control. I believe that both Shana and Lane had very different interpretations of what the meeting at the hotel on August 23rd, 2016 represented. For him, I'm sure that he went there expecting this to be Shana telling him she was dumping her boyfriend and that he was the only man she wanted. Instead, the exact opposite happened. She said she never wanted to see him again. It was at that moment it finally clicked in Michael Lane's head that she was being serious. It was over. She wasn't going to pay him attention anymore. She was going to be with other men. He couldn't stand the thought of this. This was not what he expected of her. This is not what he dictated. So he decided that, as the ultimate punishment, to demonstrate to her who ultimately was in control between them, and to ensure they would not have to see her getting on with her life, he was going to murder her, and he did this less than 48 hours later. After the murder, Lane was completely calm, and this presentation is common amongst stalkers who go on to kill. In some cases, they almost seem cheerful, and the reason for this is because they see nothing wrong in what they've done. They feel entitled to end the lives of those who leave them. In their mind, it's akin to throwing out an object which is now no longer of use to them. Michael Lane's prolific behaviour, his underlying issues, and the savagery of his crime against Shana Grice makes me think that, immediately upon being able to, he will continue this pattern of victimisation of women, whether this is in 25 years or 50 years. He will always be a danger for the rest of his life. I wanted to cover this case for an important reason, as stalking is unfortunately a huge indicator of domestic homicide, i.e. the killing of a current or former intimate partner. A recent study suggested that in the UK, in 94% of these cases, stalking occurred in the weeks and months before the murder. Around 1 in 6 women will be stalked at some point in their lifetime, and men are not immune either, with the figure being around 1 in 10. This does include other types of stalkers, such as those who fixate on strangers, but these individuals are less common, and whilst they do, they don't often escalate to murder. However, regardless, the point remains that stalking is a terrifying crime which can have fatal consequences. So what can you do? It's difficult sometimes with these cases because I highlight terrible police failings, and I'm worried that this might deter people from calling the authorities. But I do want to give some reassurance that, and this is personal knowledge, in the years since Shana's death, more has been done to educate professionals in the UK in various criminal justice agencies to make them understand how dangerous stalkers can be. More of these types of people are being prosecuted and more are being imprisoned. I went from dealing with maybe 1 or 2 stalkers in 5 years to about 10 across 2 months. Unfortunately, this progress has not been quick enough, and many other women have lost their lives during this time. So it's very important, and I'm saying this to both people experiencing stalking and their friends and family, to act quickly with something like this. So as a starting point, there are services out there that can give you advice and practical support. In the UK, I want to highlight 2 really good services. All contact information or website addresses will be in the description. The first is the National Stalking Helpline. You can give guidance on reporting stalking or harassment, effective gathering of evidence, ensuring your personal safety and that of your friends and family, and practical steps to reduce the risk. You can approach them if you're male or female, and they can be called on 0808 802 0300, and you'll speak to a confidential advisor. Their helpline is open 9:30am to 8pm Monday and Wednesday, and 9:30am to 4pm Tuesday, Thursday and Friday. Unfortunately, they're not open over the weekend. In order to email them, you have to fill in an online form. I also want to highlight another organisation, which is called Protection Against Stalking. It appears they offer similar services to the National Stalking Helpline, but when I looked on their website, there were 2 things that stood out. It appears that you can access a free consultation with a solicitor as part of their service, where you can discuss legal options to stop your stalker, like civil injunctions. Also, it mentions about trauma support services to help survivors put their lives back together. I couldn't see specifically whether this service is for both men and women, but they're worth contacting. I couldn't find a phone number, but there is an email address, which is support@protectionagainststalking, all one word, .org. So send them an email and see if they can help you. I also found a website with more local regional support services, which I'll leave a link to in the description. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that there's a dedicated support service for stalking in Ireland. It appears that the closest thing is the Sexual Violence Centre in Cork, which you can call on 1800 496 496 or email at info@sexualviolence, all one word, .ie. I've read they offer advice and support, but unfortunately the information is limited. In the US, it was a struggle to find a central service, but it seems a good place to start for signposting is the National Centre for Victims of Crime, which you can contact via telephone on 202 467 8700. You can also email them on info@victimsofcrime, all one word, .org. Most of the websites I've seen give advice for victims of stalking to keep themselves safe and get justice, and I want to summarise some of these, but also add my own. So, the most important thing is tell everyone. Tell friends, family, tell work. Make all these people aware you're scared and ask them for help. Try as best as you can to not being placed on your own for the time being until things are sorted out. This is to have a witness, but also for emotional support. Speak to your employer about someone accompanying you to and from work. If you live with people, tell them what's going on. If you live alone, then move in with a friend or family, even temporarily, if you can. I know you shouldn't have to upend your life because of the behaviour of one pathetic individual, but your safety is paramount. The second important thing is evidence gathering. Log everything. Every phone call, every text, every email, every sighting. Take photos of everything, compile them, and write a diary. This links into the next point, which is to call the police. Be as precise as possible. Lay everything out. Offer to send over all your evidence. Keep a log of who you talk to. Ask for their name, rank, and their number. One thing I think is also important is to check your vehicle. Tracking devices, in my experience, seem to be becoming more frequent. Check yourself or ask a friend to look under your car, particularly in the wheel arch, for any suspicious devices. Unfortunately, these trackers can be very small, so potentially the best thing to do is to take it to a garage for a more thorough inspection. If you find something, do not touch it or move it. Photograph it in situ and call the police, advising what you found and that they need to come and seize it as evidence. This is a particularly important step if you find that your stalker keeps appearing where you are and you have no explanation for this. There's also the potential that your stalker installs something on your phone without your knowledge to track you. Go through your apps and delete anything that you think looks suspicious. Turn off your location settings and consider resetting the device. Ultimately, it's about you taking back control. The evidence you gather can be used to argue for the stalker to be sent to prison, and from that point, agencies have more power to be able to manage and control them, which can include being banned from the area, even if this is only temporary. However, if you feel in immediate danger, then do not hesitate. Call the emergency services. I'll be honest, there will always be people like PC Fucknut, but there are far more people, especially in more recent years, who are like me and who will do whatever they can to help and protect you. So please, reach out for support. So, had you heard of this case before? What's your thoughts? Please leave your comments below. If you like the content, then consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button. You can also send a one-off donation to support the channel using the thanks button. Please like, share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.